Britain worshipped her as the nation's grandmother, all warmth, charm, and courage. That charm was a weapon. Behind the smile was a woman who took what she wanted, crushed anyone who crossed her, and never paid the price. The real Queen Mother wasn't a saint. She was the most calculating figure the modern monarchy ever produced. And almost no one saw through her. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was born in 1900 at Glamis Castle in Scotland, a medieval fortress that had belonged to her family for over 600 years. It was the kind of place where the walls held centuries of memory, where secret rooms and ghost stories were part of the furniture. She grew up among tapestries and stone corridors. The castle had sheltered kings and survived rebellions. It was not a childhood of palaces and protocol. It was something older, something less rehearsed. When the First World War came, Glamis was converted into a convalescent hospital. Wounded soldiers arrived from the trenches by the hundreds. Elizabeth was a teenager. She played cards with the men. She wrote letters for those who could no longer hold a pen. She sat beside beds and listened. She was a young woman in a castle full of broken men, and she learned something that would shape the rest of her life. She learned how to make people feel comforted, how to project warmth so completely that no one thought to question it. She learned how to win sympathy, genuine, instinctive, unshakable sympathy, from strangers who felt they had been truly seen. This was not a skill most girls of her station bothered to develop. She mastered it before she turned 18. Then she caught the attention of Prince Albert, known to his family as Bertie. He was the shy, stammering second son of King George V, living permanently in the shadow of his older brother, Prince Edward. Where Edward was charming and effortless and adored, Bertie struggled. He had been forced to write with his right hand, though he was naturally left-handed. His tutors had been brutal. His father was impatient. The stammer that formed in childhood never left him. It made every public appearance an ordeal. According to several biographers, Elizabeth recognized Albert's vulnerability almost immediately. His stammer, his crippling self-doubt, his quiet conviction that he would never be enough. She positioned herself as his emotional anchor, the one person who could steady him, the one person he could not function without. And through that role, she gradually cemented her place within the royal family. Before we go further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from. I'm always amazed how far these royal history videos travel. What she had built with Bertie would soon face a test no one saw coming. Because the brother who stood above him was about to bring the entire monarchy crashing down. The year was 1936. King Edward VIII had been on the throne for less than a year when he announced his intention to marry Wallis Simpson. She was a twice-divorced American, and the Church of England, over which the monarch himself served as supreme governor, would not permit it. The choice was stark. Edward could keep the crown, or he could keep the woman. He could not have both. He chose Wallis. On December 11th, 1936, Edward signed the instruments of abdication and addressed the nation by radio. Then he departed for the continent. The throne fell to his younger brother, Albert, who had never been raised for the role, who had stammered through public speeches his entire life, who had existed comfortably in the shadow of his charismatic older brother, was now King George VI. According to many historians, Elizabeth never forgave Wallis Simpson. She believed Simpson had deliberately pushed her husband into a position he was never meant to hold. What followed was not a single outburst. It was a campaign. At Balmoral, Sidon, Assistant Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon orchestrated Simpson's public humiliation. The household treated Wallis with cold formality. The family maintained a rigid, calculated distance. Every seating arrangement, every introduction, every meal was engineered to remind her that she did not belong. But the true weapon was something far more surgical. Elizabeth refused to grant Simpson the title, Her Royal Highness. Those three letters, HRH, were not a courtesy. They were the dividing line between those who belonged to the sovereign's family and those who existed outside it. Without them, Simpson would remain technically less than royal for the rest of her life, no matter whom she had married. Every official document, every newspaper reference, every formal introduction would carry the permanent mark of her exclusion. It was a sentence of lifelong diminishment, handed down by a woman who understood the system intimately and knew exactly where to strike. And according to some accounts, Elizabeth went further still, playing a quiet role in pushing the Windsors into near-permanent exile. Banished to Paris and the Bahamas, kept at arm's length from the court they believed was rightfully theirs. A title snub might sound trivial to us, but in the royal world, it was as devastating as a public exile. What do you think? If that level of royal pettiness sounds insane to you, comment number 4 inches below, because coming up, we're about to look at an even stranger royal tradition, one most outsiders can barely believe is real. By 1940, conflicts across Europe were endangering traditional institutions. For the British Crown, demonstrating solidarity with the public was vital to its survival. Elizabeth refused to leave London, kept her daughters in the country. Rather than evacuating them overseas, and regularly visited neighbourhoods affected by heavy air raids. When strikes hit Buckingham Palace in September 1940, Elizabeth publicly stated that she was glad the palace was affected, as it allowed her to share the exact experiences of the public. That response bridged the gap between the institution and the nation. The public saw their sovereign enduring the same trials as they were. Behind the public appearances, Elizabeth steadily encouraged her husband through severe strain. George VI faced immense exhaustion as he maintained a rigorous schedule of troop inspections factory visits, and public broadcasts. She understood that the crown's stability depended on constant visibility, guiding the public image, while supporting a monarch carrying a burden he had never originally anticipated. In 1952, George VI died suddenly. He was 57 years old. The toll that had been mounting behind closed doors had finally caught up with him. Some insider accounts from the period claim Elizabeth partly blamed Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. The reasoning ran straight and unforgiving. Albert had been thrust onto a throne he was never trained for. He had been made to carry a monarchy through a world war. He had been forced to perform the role his brother had walked away from, and the strain of it had ground him down year after year until there was nothing left to give. This was not a confirmed medical conclusion. It was grief hardened into something more permanent. A woman who had watched her husband diminish for 16 years and knew exactly where to assign the debt. She never forgot what the abdication had cost her family. She never forgave it either. As Queen Mother, she did not retreat into widowhood. She held her ground. She retained significant influence within the royal family, and she exercised it. The clearest example came when Princess Margaret fell in love with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced former royal equerry. The parallels were almost exact. A royal figure, a divorced partner. The same obstacle that had cost Edward VIII his throne and placed Albert on it against his will. Elizabeth blocked the relationship. She enforced the same standard that had been imposed on her own family, the same standard that had rewritten her entire life, and she did so without visible hesitation. Margaret was told the match could not proceed. Townsend was sent abroad. The romance was over. She also shaped young Prince Charles's upbringing during these years. She had opinions about how a future king should be raised. Charles was sent to Gordonstoun, the Spartan boarding school in Scotland that his father had attended. The Queen Mother supported the decision. She believed character was forged through hardship. She had watched her own husband become king through crisis and knew what the throne demanded. It demanded resilience. It demanded discipline. She took a direct interest in Charles's development. She cultivated in him an appreciation for tradition, for ceremony, for the weight of inheritance. She was not a passive grandmother. She was a strategist operating across generations. Her position as one of the most influential figures behind the young Queen Elizabeth II was not ceremonial. It was operational, but the public saw none of this. What they saw was a widow in black, a grieving mother who had lost her husband and carried on with dignity. It would prove to be one of the most effective disguises the modern monarchy had ever built. And it came with a price that almost no one outside the palace walls would ever see. The price was staggering. The woman the public believed had shared their wartime sacrifice, who had walked through bombed streets in rationed clothes, and won the nation's gratitude through apparent humility, maintained a household that operated on a scale few outside the palace walls could comprehend. She lived as Edwardian aristocrats had lived before the First World War. As if the decades of rationing and economic recovery had simply never reached her door. The Britain that emerged from the war was a nation of clothing coupons and utility furniture, and gardens dug over for vegetables. Elizabeth's Britain, as the public imagined it, was the same Britain. That was the image. That was the story carefully maintained and dutifully consumed. And the British public paid for it. The civil list covered it. Royal grants sustained it. Nobody questioned it, because nobody outside a small circle of palace officials knew the full extent of what was being spent. Her personal staff numbered over 50. Footmen, maids, dressers, valets, chauffeurs, each role filled by a specific person with specific duties. Nothing was combined. Nothing was streamlined. The household operated exactly as it had been structured in the 1920s. Nothing modernized. Nothing reduced. She maintained an expensive passion for thoroughbred racehorses, breeding and racing them at Royal Ascot, with the focused intensity of a woman who treated the sport as something closer to a calling than a pastime. The cost of maintaining a racing stable was enormous, even by the standards of the very wealthy. Bloodstock purchases, trainer fees, stable staff, transportation, veterinary care. The expenses came every season without exception, and every season she expanded the operation a little further. But behind the champagne and the thoroughbreds and the army of servants, the money was running out. The spending never slowed. No budget held it back. No advisor reined it in. Year after year, the costs accumulated with the steady, unbroken rhythm of a woman who had decided long ago that certain standards would simply never be lowered. According to several British news sources, Elizabeth's unchecked spending left her millions of pounds in personal debt by the end of her life. A sum so large, it reportedly had to be quietly settled with direct financial support from her own daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen paying off the debts that a lifetime of Edwardian extravagance had left behind. The settlement was handled discreetly. No public announcement. No published accounting. The machinery of the palace absorbed the transaction, the way it absorbed everything else. The woman who built her legend on shared sacrifice was carrying a fortune in unpaid bills. And she was not finished. Not yet. The spending would continue for decades. The debts would keep climbing, and the public would never see a single line of it. As long as she remained alive to make certain they didn't. She died in 2002. She was 101 years old. She had outlived nearly everyone who had ever known the woman beneath the crown. She was widely credited with preserving the monarchy's public image through the abdication crisis and the Second World War. That credit was real. It was earned. But it was only half the story. The abdication crisis of 1936 had brought the monarchy closer to destruction than any event in 3 centuries. Edward VIII's determination to marry Wallis Simpson had fractured the institution. The government threatened to resign. The dominions were in revolt. The Church of England was scandalized. When the throne passed to her husband, Elizabeth understood what was required. Stability. Dignity. A family image that could replace the spectacle of a king who chose love over duty. The royal tours. The public appearances. The carefully staged domesticity. She engineered a version of royalty, that felt human without surrendering an inch of its mystique. Then came the war. The bombing of London. The suggestion that the princesses be evacuated to Canada. She refused. The children would stay. She would stay. Buckingham Palace took 9 direct hits during the Blitz. She kept walking the East End streets through the rubble. She understood what images could accomplish, and she used them. The other half was the woman behind the legend, the nation's grandmother. That was the image the public carried. The twinkling eyes, the pastel suits, the cheerful wave from the palace balcony. According to many historians, it was only part of the picture. The rest was something harder. A tightly controlling woman, deeply ambitious, relentless in ways the public never saw. She had chosen her husband. She had chosen his throne. She had chosen which relatives would be welcomed and which would be exiled. She had chosen which grandchildren would be molded and which would be left alone. Every decision that could be controlled, she controlled. Every door that could be shut, she shut. The charm was genuine, but it was also armor. And it was also a weapon, one she sharpened and deployed with precision for more than 7 decades. The debate over just how much real influence she wielded would outlive her. Some biographers argued she was the single most powerful figure in the royal family for half a century, more so than the monarch she served. Others saw her power as something softer, cultural, diffused through private channels, rather than exercised through direct command. The truth was likely locked in correspondence that would never be released. In conversations that died with the people who had them. In rooms no historian would ever enter. Her long life had reflected a degree of royal privilege and ruthless personal decision-making that the mourning public never fully glimpsed. The estates told their own story. The Castle May in Scotland, Royal Lodge at Windsor, Clarence House in London, refurbished at a cost of more than £1 million after her husband's death. The staffing required to maintain these residences, numbered in the hundreds. She kept horse breeding operations. She kept a racing stable. She entertained on a scale that made other European royals look cautious. None of it was negotiated. She had decided what a queen mother deserved. And she had it. But even in her final years, she was not finished. She was still hosting, still spending, still planning her future, as though she had another century ahead of her. She was still hosting at 97, still reviewing guest lists and ordering champagne by the case for dinners months away, still personally arranging flowers at Clarence House at 98, still planning garden parties at 99. Friends who visited in those final years described a woman who regarded mortality as something that happened to other people. She had inherited great wealth and lived an extravagantly Edwardian lifestyle, spending as though the bills would never come due. She was the life of every party she attended, right to the end. She died at 101. The nation called her grandmother. But the charm was always the weapon. The courage was real. The warmth was real. But beneath both lay an iron will that had pushed a reluctant king onto his throne, exiled a woman she never forgave, and spent public money on private luxury without hesitation. She had learned at Glamis Castle how to make people love her. And she had spent the next 80 years using that love as a shield. The smile had been real. The charm had been real. But they had always been the weapon. And the woman behind them had spent a century getting exactly what she wanted.